our English word ethics is actually just a transliteration of an ancient Greek word, which means expressing character.
Today I'm here with Dr. Reese, and I'm going to be asking a few questions in regards to ethics in his work. It's very good to have you here.
Good to be here.
Okay, so my first question for you today is, across disciplines, ethics means different things to different scholars. What is ethics to you?
Right. Well, as a scholar who specializes in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, I'll just point out that our English word ethics is actually just a transliteration of an ancient Greek word, which means expressing character. The word is ethikos. And the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle is perhaps chiefly responsible for popularizing it. Not surprisingly, his ethical writings are concerned with the development and the expression of good character and the kind of questions that ethics addressed in Aristotle's day in this ancient tradition. Question's a pretty broad one. How should we live, or how should we conduct our lives? So understood in this way, I think ethics ranges over many areas and aspects of life. So ethics, at least as I understand it, is a sustained attempt to answer this broad and wide-ranging question in all of these areas and aspects of our lives.
Right. Okay. So then what pushed you to study ancient philosophy?
Right. Well, as an undergraduate, I went to the University of Michigan, and I was initially interested in pursuing a career in law. And this was a blessing in disguise because, unlike other sorts of vocational, or as nowadays it's referred to, professional training, unlike these professional subjects like medicine or engineering, there wasn't a long list of course requirements or any sort of set pre-law track in the way that there are pre-med tracks and pre-engineering tracks. And this allowed me to enroll in courses that I thought looked interesting. I took courses in a number of disciplines: anthropology, astronomy, cosmology, economics, English, history, physics, political science, psychology. I mean, you name it. But obviously, philosophy as well, which I eventually chose as my major. And it was my initial exposure in philosophy to the dialogues of Plato in particular that really turned out to be a transformative experience for me, because here was a thinker who wasn't merely articulating some very fundamental ethical questions and questions of all kinds that I had always thought about in some nascent form. But here's a thinker who carefully and systematically is exploring possible answers to them. And from that point on, I was more or less hooked.
Awesome. So was there any specific theories that Plato had that like really pushed you to study it more?
That's a great follow-up. I think it was really Plato's Apology, which is his account of the trial of somebody that he was quite close with, Socrates, who was accused at the age of 70 of corrupting the youth and being impious. It was reading that work and the way and the method that Socrates used to think through the issues and quite effectively, in my view, debunk the charges that really excited me. It was a way of thinking that I hadn't seen before. But of course, as I read more and more of Plato, his most famous theory, perhaps, is the so-called theory of forms, which posits that ideas, in some sense, are more fundamental or more real than the things that we usually take to be fundamental or real, like the things we can see or touch. So that's a very interesting view of Plato's that caught my eye as well.
That's very interesting. That's really cool that Plato was the one that pushed you to study it. That's not a lot of people's choice
Not a
for
lot
it,
of people, yeah.
but I like it.
Mm-hmm.
So could you tell us about the connections of ethics to your work specifically?
Yeah. I mean, ethics is really where I think the rubber meets the road, because we all have to act and make choices in our lives. So it's probably worth thinking about which actions and choices are good ones. And indeed, our actions and choices are awfully simply expressions of, I don't know, more or less settled ways of acting or thinking or feeling. So another way of saying that, to draw on what I was mentioning earlier with Aristotle, is that they're really expressions of our character. So my work in ethics examines not just what constitutes good character, but also is sort of concerned to think about, address how we might actually come to acquire good character in the first place. And of course, education itself plays a fundamental role, at least for many of these ancient thinkers that I'm concerned with.
Cool. That's These are great answers. I'm
Hey,
getting
all right.
answers from you.
Mhm.
So then you kind of touched on it in your last answer, but has ethics been a large part of your studies?
I mean, I'd say in a way. So if ethics is where the rubber meets the road, then I think much of the rest of philosophy is kind of preparation for the journey. We'd all like to believe that at least usually we're acting well and making good choices. But how many of us have thought deeply about what makes certain actions or choices good ones, or what we even mean? For example, if we call them good, I mean, are they really good? Haven't you been mistaken before? How are you so sure that you're not mistaken now? Um, Answering these sorts of questions in a fully satisfying way is, at least in my view, important preparation before the rubber ever meets the road. So ethics has been a large part of my study insofar as I care about acting well and making good choices, but I'm at least as occupied with these more, let's call them upstream philosophical questions, because the answers to them directly inform both the choices I make and the actions I perform.
Right. So right now you currently have a few projects in the works. So could you expand on your recent work with them and how it relates to possibly ethics?
Yeah, so I do have a few projects in the work, and I think really all of them are in some way concerned with ethics, although, as I just alluded to, they're also largely concerned with more upstream philosophical questions. But for example, I'm currently working on a project that explores the notion of self-mastery or self-control in the works of Plato and Aristotle. So we've all, I think, had the familiar experience of thinking that we should do one thing, but then doing something else instead, right? We think we should eat the salad, but instead we wind up eating the delicious piece of cake that's sitting right next to it. Um, on this sort of view, we display self-mastery or self-control whenever we think we should do something and then we actually do that thing. So when we think, oh, I really should eat the salad, and then we actually do eat the salad and not the delicious piece of cake. Plato and Aristotle actually develop quite rich accounts of self-mastery or self-control, which have wide-ranging ethical implications across their work that I'm currently exploring.
Right. So could you expand on some of the other work you're doing at the moment right now? Because I'm pretty curious as to like the other projects you have going on.
Right. So that's actually a series of papers that are being written on those issues. But there's actually a more perfect version of self-mastery, for instance, that both Plato and Aristotle recognize. They call it the excellence or the virtue of moderation. And moderation isn't just being faced with a difficult choice and doing the thing that we think we ought to do. Moderation is not even feeling the pull of the option that is the wrong one to feel. So moderation, in a sense, is even more perfect, or you might think of it as a perfected version of self-mastery or self-control. And that's the thing both Plato and Aristotle think we're really ultimately after at the end of the day. And of course, the connection between self-mastery and moderation is challenging and difficult in certain senses to fully articulate. And so another piece of work that I'm handling right now is how to make sense of the virtue of moderation in the works of Plato and Aristotle, because there are complications to this view. So that's another example of a project.
Right. Okay, so I only have one question left for you today.
Hey,
I
all right.
I know. So do you have anything else that you would like people to know in regard to your studies and your area of work?
When people hear philosophy or philosophers, right, it, this is often thought to be an esoteric discipline. It's disconnected. right? It has little or no practical upshot. And while philosophers, I think, are often caricatured as having their heads in the clouds and little connection with or concern for what's happening in our everyday world, that couldn't be further from the truth. So I mentioned earlier that not only the word ethics, but the discipline itself has its roots in philosophy. But many other disciplines also have their roots in philosophy. So just to mention a few, astronomy, biology, cosmology, logic, physics, zoology, the list goes on. All of these originally started as being part and parcel of philosophy. And there's actually a bit of evidence for this. A vestige of this fact is that the highest degree that you can earn in any of the disciplines I just mentioned is a PhD. And do you have any sense of what PhD stands for?
PhD, what it stands
Yeah.
for? I
Yeah.
actually do not.
Yeah. So
How
it's
did I-
yeah, so it's actually stands for Doctor of Philosophy. So these
Wow.
are all doctors of philosophy. You can be a doctor of philosophy in biology. You can be a doctor of philosophy in physics. That's what PhD stands for. So these traditions have, of course, branched off from philosophy, some quite a long time ago. But I think it's important to recognize that philosophy is actually where they all began. So far from being an esoteric and disconnected discipline, it's actually the root and the source of many of the disciplines that we think are very important and highly practical today. Of course, philosophers have kept some of these areas for themselves, like, for instance, ethics. But even philosophers aren't the only ones working on ethics these days.
That was great. Well, thank you so much for coming on today and talking about your work and everything, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Anytime.